Thank you, Wendy. We will spend the next few minutes doing some more classroom applications as we had before. And leading this will be someone from our team, Howard University Center for African Studies. That's Dr. Helen Bond. And she is the Associate Professor of Curriculum and Instruction in the School of Education at Howard University. She has a PhD in Human Development from Virginia Tech, a master's degree in communications from West Virginia University, and a bachelor's of science degree in education from Ohio State University. She has experience in education and human development in Africa and India, Germany, Bangladesh, and the US. She was selected as a Fulbright Nehru Scholar to India in 2012, provided training for teachers in refugee camps along the border of Ethiopia and Somalia in 2013 to 2014. She assisted UNICEF's West and Central Africa Regional Office with the post-Ebola effort by helping to develop a literacy and numeracy curriculum that would enable youth to catch up on a missed education. And she also served as an expert for the Ministries of Education in Ethiopia and in the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP, in 2008 to develop a countrywide teacher licensing system. Impressive resume. Please come and you can dive in from here.
Actually, that's an older.
It is.
Thank you for the introduction. Oh, no, no worries, because actually I'm a full professor now, but that's okay. So I want to take just a few of your minutes, and I want to do two things. I want to introduce you to some additional tools that you can even dig deeper in stories like this as classroom teachers. And I want to talk a little bit about how to use sacred text in a secular setting, secular classroom. So I'd like for you, as well as our online audience, to go inside, and I'm going to be sort of speaking from here so I can make sure I can look at the screen. You could go inside your folder and pull out the story organizer, as well as our audience online, and the cultural representation organizer. You know, while you're doing that, I just had one thought, and I wasn't able to ask it when Wendy and Dawit was up here. I wonder how much we adapt these stories for modern day times, this notion of disability and caretaking, because we know historical memory changes over time. So that's just wanted to discuss that, but we lost a little bit of time. Okay, teachers online, this is your time, especially for the first 5 to 7 minutes. You have or should have taken out by now your story organizer and a cultural representation organizer. These are commonly called, and you know better than I, as sort of concept maps, story maps, organizers. And I'd like to start out by looking at the story organizer and get your ideas on how you might use this. But let's take a look at it first. The story organizer, and as we were discussing, going deeper a little bit about the story, I was thinking about that this story organizer would certainly support that effort. But how might you, those online, please feel free to put it in the question and answer area of the course or even the chat. How might you use this in your classroom to dig deeper? We had a really robust discussion in chat. I'm imagining in middle school and high school, you may need something a little bit more structured for students, certain amount of time and a support, sort of a scaffold. Okay, so how might you use this? First block says, describe the main characters, gender, age, ethnicity, class, rank. Do the characters change over time? What is the story organizer meant to do? By the way, I want to give kudos to Brenda for coming up with this, redesigning this, and I've tried this out in my classroom. I want to say that. How might you use this to really dig deeper, to get a better sense? What, for example, what's the story organizer meant to do? If you were to use this, what are you trying to do? Yes.
Get the kids to understand the story better by, you know, information and
Okay, asking questions about plot, setting, yes.
They have to use inference as well as what's directly stated, like they can't just go with what the text says, they have to like interpret it.
Okay, very good, excellent.
Students, I think it facilitates critical thinking comprehension, like she mentioned, not just, it makes you reflect and, you know, enrich contributions to what, like she said, the story is talking about.
Okay, because it's asking about the main problem, the challenge. Asking students to summarize, maybe to structure some ideas and concepts, yes.
I think thinking of it as kind of a scaffold to get students to the type of discussion that we had. Like, for example, the first question described the main characters, like that would help students get to that, noticing that it's all women in the text, maybe to ask questions about their class or rank, just as we did kind of without this question, but this helps students to get there directly.
Okay, and I'm going to ask someone to look in the Q&A for our online group. But what's the overall purpose of using concept organizers or story maps? What's the key idea behind that? Yes.
We always talk about like how can you help students make their thinking visible? Because a lot of times they have so many ideas that are racing around their head, and if you've got some type of thinking frame, then they can begin to organize them and see patterns.
Very good. So the notion of a concept organizer is to enable the students to actually see the relationships between the ideas. Okay. We're going to see, could you go ahead and read that? Sure. Which one is it? Oh. Helping students to pull out the details, to help them weave together the analysis. Very good. Now, the next comment is talking about the cultural organizer. Let's pull up the cultural organizer. The story organizer enables students to structure the plot, the setting, enables them to capture the ideas. We have a similar organizer, and I do believe that Brenda put this one together. I think it's very useful.
Well, yeah, I did that because I review books, and I came up with this as a way of helping me really go through the story. And what I found was when I used this, I oftentimes would totally change my opinion of the book, because it really made me, you know, really to dig deeper into the story. What is it showing us? And as I would say to people, I mean, the story organizer, if you're an English teacher, you've probably seen something very similar to that. Probably the only thing I added to that was like gender or in class. I haven't seen, you know, those necessarily. But the cultural organizer, the cultural representation was, yeah, something different that I created. And it just helped me write better reviews. Now, getting kids to use this will be a challenge, because it is labor. I can't hardly get the reviewers to write for me, you know, when I'm the editor to do it, because it's labor intensive. But truly, if you as the teacher are doing it, I think you will then pull out so many things that are teachable things that you can provide for students, because it will be taking you deeper into this culture than what may appear on the surface.
Very good.
It's gonna mention that one can use this, say at the beginning of the semester, when you're getting to learn the different students that are coming in. It can be used as an icebreaker. In occupational therapy, from the healthcare perspective, we have something called the occupational profile, so to speak. So all of these facets would be found in there, where you interview or speak to a client or a patient, and you're trying to learn about them as a person. So a lot of these things are actually found in the OT practice framework, where it breaks down basic ADLs, and you look into the cultural context and things of that nature. So I could see how this can help to address the cultural perspective.
I might add to that part of this too is, you know, we're trying, particularly with the economy and technology, which is what they're teaching sixth graders. They have no concept of what an economy is. What is it about? So, you know, you're teaching them goods and services. So what we tried to do was to put, you know, in the fine print down here, things that are related to that topic, because we're really in a way kind of teaching them a little theory here, in a simpler way, but to dig into, you know, what are human resources? What are capital resources? what, and that's in their textbooks, but if you're not really teaching it, they're really not gonna learn it. I came up with a game in which I had a chart and they had to move, let's say, an animal, whether it was a capital resource or it was a commodity, because it can be both. And we just had toys and we played with them. And that way, I think they were actually learning, okay, this is what an economy is. These are what the parts of it are. And so that's the theory behind some of these things.
It's interesting, with classical teaching, kind of incorporates this, only the only reason I know that, also it's very familiar, my sixth grader. And even my current eighth grader who's graduated and it's ninth grade. They come with these things and I'm like, oh yeah, this is neat. What is this? And step by step, she's actually recreating the comprehension piece, right? Recreating the story, retelling the story, and I can follow just from the graph and the chart. But I see this more, I don't know, to students like it's a classical teaching as well. It might be a frame that is borrowed, but I appreciate it. It gives me a good understanding of how they're also absorbing the material and how it's being taught by the school. So I've seen it as well, and I appreciate I especially like the cultural manuscript. No one speaks to me. Which one is more common? Educators,
The story organizer, yeah, then you'll see, you know, who are the characters, what's the problem. Although they don't often ask who did what to solve the problem. And that was a part that I kind of added in there.
So for social studies teachers, though, the cultural, one more like the cultural representation organizer is more common. Sometimes it's called like a spice chart or grapes. There's different acronyms that are, it's not exactly the same, but it's quite similar. So I just think it can be really powerful then for students to see some of these things in multiple classes. Like I love the idea of using the story organizer, which isn't something that I would typically use as a history teacher to help students, you know, analyze one of these sources from a history perspective. So really helpful. And then just a note about the cultural representation, that when I have students do things like this, sometimes I have them jigsaw the different parts of it. So that's one option. If this is too much for students, you have like a group that's going to look at geography, a group that's going to look at economy, and then they can share with each other.
I just want to piggyback off what she's saying, being a history teacher, this would also make a very rich project at the end of the semester or something, because there's so much information here, and if they're working in groups, it facilitates a conversation about the economy, geography, things like that, and then they would really know what they're talking about or what they've learned when this is demonstrated in a project.
Yeah, I was about to ask, you know, in the instructional day or the instructional time, the unit plan, when can you actually introduce a story organizer or a concept map? You can actually do it before instruction. What would you use it for prior to instruction, prior to reading, prior to the lesson? You could look for pre-assessment, activating prior knowledge. You could use it during instruction, during the pedagogical as a tool to teach, but you can also use it as an assessment. How might it work as an assessment? And then I'm going to go to part 2 here.
Yes, we actually do an assessment like this, like you were saying with the spice chart, like my district likes grapes, like that's their preferred acronym. I'm not as crazy about that one, but you know, we do have the kids, our bond level 6th graders create posters using an organizer like this. And one of the modifications that we do for our students who are learning English as an additional language is that they can use imagery. So they don't necessarily have to have the word, but if they understand the concept, then they're able to like draw or like put together clip art in order to convey it. They can do it, and they get so excited. They love doing this because they're able to look at it and it really is like, I know all of this. Whereas getting this right paragraph is much harder.
Right. We could say a lot more. There are 2 comments online that I want to acknowledge. The cultural organizer is a great way to brainstorm with students, get students involved and engaged in the text. I teach intensive writing in another language. So actually the components of the cultural organizer would help students produce written piece. In other words, writing to understand. I want to go, I want to move that into just, we can. Here we go. Let me go back. We'll here we go. Just pull this down. Just very briefly. And I've heard mention of this notion of working with these sacred texts in a secular classroom. What are some of the considerations if you're talking about these stories, talking about these issues in classrooms where there is a supposed clear separation between church and state and religion? What are some considerations? And then I have some ideas. What are some considerations?
Various groups may be represented, right? Different cultural groups or different faith.
Okay.
Yeah. That in itself is like, you have to figure out, how do I navigate?
Right. If you're talking about these or working with these texts in a secular classroom, there's some room for what we call critical engagement of the text. The pedagogy promotes students' independent meaning making and interpretation versus a more religious classroom tends to focus on transmitting religious knowledge with a focus on knowledge and tradition, less focus on cultivating different interpretations of classical or sacred text. I want to follow that up. See here, click on here. Here we go. Another 3 ways to think about approaching the text from a literary or reading standpoint. Reading as the writer, reading as the reader, and reading as the believer. What do you think I mean here by reading as the writer? I think we've got about 5 or 6 minutes left. Yeah.
And taking into consideration the trying to see through the lens and perspective of the person that's writing, what context, their background, things of that nature. What is the objective of the piece that's being read? That they're just trying to spark a conversation, or specifically, what is the audience that they're writing to? I think that's where reading as a writer.
Reading as the writer, which one of these cultural organizers might work well if you're approaching this from doing analysis from reading as the writer? Would one of these cultural organizers help in that way? If so, which one and why?
I would probably use the cultural representation one. for
How
this.
might you use that? Great.
So we call what you described here, we call that sourcing. A little bit of close reading, but like in my district, you know, we have students look at the whole context in which the document is made. So you're not just looking at what the document says, but like what information would the author have had that they may or may not have explicitly included, like what training maybe would they have needed in order to be able to even produce something like this. So I think being able to like have students gather all of this information, maybe even before they sit down with the text, would really help them to be able to pull those pieces out.
Yeah, and if you're teaching with primary sources, you'll see a lot of overlap here. You see the overlap if you're teaching with primary sources, which is a key social studies, a key teaching really across disciplines. There's also reading as the reader, identifying the genre, purpose, of emotional tone of the text, way of exploring readers' own responses. Again, the focus is sort of on the reader, identify major plot points, and you could actually use the story organizer really in both of these structures, reading as the reader as well as the writer. Asking yourselves, how do students' view of the situation impact how they feel about what's happened within the story? What about the last? Reading as the believer. What's the difference here? What's focused on here? What's changed if you're going to approach this? You're in a more theological lens here. You might talk about what a believer would take from this story. What can we say or infer about believers at the time the story was written? How might this story inform a believer today? So there's 3 different perspectives on which you could approach sacred texts from a literary standpoint here. Very quickly, there's 2, I mean, I've seen this talked about in a lot of different ways when you're working, talking about material in non-secular environments. There's something called what we call transmission pedagogy. And you see it's very direct form of learning, almost didactical a little bit. The teacher asks the class a question, calls on students for answers, teacher evaluating the students' answers and so forth, the teacher providing elaborating on the answer, what's the correct answer, is a way that if you're just focusing on what we call transmitting knowledge, that's a way that sometimes this is handled in secular classrooms. Then there's a more interpretive facilitation pedagogy, what we call IFP, and it sort of gives a sense. I'm going to let you look at that, and I don't have them side by side, but I'm going to ask you as we wrap up, what do you see as the difference? And I've seen it in many different ways. This is very closely actually to the first one, but what do you see as the difference between this notion of the transmission pedagogy as a way to work with text, sacred texts in secular classrooms versus the interpretive facilitation pedagogy? Student reads a verse or 2, teacher calls on student to ask a question, teacher repeats the question, invites students' responses, teacher asks follow-up questions to the students' responses. After students elaborated on the response, teacher summarizes it. Teacher then calls on another student to offer a response to the original question. What's the difference between these 2? And I'm going to wrap up with that.
Even just how they start, kind of the idea that the students are the ones that are coming up with the questions, they're generating it. It's on a teacher generated question, is already going to give so many more possible outcomes.
Mhm. And there's a lot of different overlays in which you could focus on. That one may be more culturally responsive, one may be a little less culturally responsive. But it's another way to think about as you approach a secular classroom. I'm going to, I think I flipped out of this, but I'd like to see what's online before I sit down, if there's any comments from our online audience. We can stop the share. I imagine that will enable us to. Okay, one last comment from some students may be deeply invested in their own faith perspectives and may struggle with critical engagement. That's a really good comment there. Any other questions or comments?
One more comment.
Oh, one more comment? Oh my gosh, what a long comment here. Wonderful. Teaching art history at a secular school, I am also surprised how students might not have context. So I think it's also important to level the playing field in a secular environment and give context. I also discuss learning about cultures through a lens of anthropology, where all beliefs are valid to the origin group, and also explain values of the group. If a student brings up their own religious disagreement, this comes up with the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia, where Jewish students might disagree, and we discuss suspending our own belief systems to make a bridge with others. Let me just ask you as we wrap up, what other concerns? I talked about some practices and strategies in which we can use. What other concerns and solutions might we have as we talk about sacred texts? Not in a religious way, not in a way to convert, to proselytize, to persuade, but to inform, to teach. What other concerns might there be? Yes, Dawit.
Not concern, but possible solution is, when I talk about this from a secular perspective, again, I'm into tradition. And I've talked to a room full of Orthodox and non-Orthodox people. And I say up front, the veracity of the stories are not in question. And the reason why I do this is I think, and I say it up front, I think it's a boring question to ask. Did these stories take place or not, right? So when I'm saying this, I'm addressing both rooms. To the believer, I'm telling him, we're not here to say these stories didn't happen, they're fake, they're not real. And to the non-believer, I'm not asking him to believe in these stories. The veracity of the questions, we're just not asking that question. We're looking at the literature from a literature perspective. So for the non-believer, don't believe in it. To the believer, keep believing in it. But it's just, again, it's not at the center.
Right.
And I found that to be somewhat.
That is a question of saying.
That for the audience, right, the consumer, this information, even having done this for my own, it's so important to understand the bigger context in which the conversations are happening. Once you set the stage, I think you can move forward with what your agenda is to get to the ideas or even for solutions and kind of outside the box thinking. But unless that's done, even for the young, right? The young new, if the stage isn't set so that everybody's aware where we are and what we're trying to do, you'll end up with these kind of, everybody will be everywhere and it's hard to contain and bring them back to the main agenda. So I love the idea of you must give context, right? And in giving context, you kind of address almost everyone's questions that are running through their head. And unless you do that, you may not kind of, your agenda.
We had another hand.
I always, in my classes, we talk about how the students are the historians. So they have to look at our documents and our sources as a historian, look at them. And I found that my students that have personal beliefs, they can look at a document as a historian, but then they'll also, in our discussion, they'll bring up what they know about it, or what the story or the event might mean to them, or what they have learned about it in the past. And so, but I also thought when Dr. Belcher started today and said, I'm not, we're not looking at these as religious, as a religious discussion, but as scholars, and I think that also students can hear that and they can understand that when it's presented in the classroom.
And to be very clear about your student learning outcomes. These are the 3 things or 2 things that I want you to learn from this, not a matter of faith, but of context and other things. By pointing that out. Okay, I think that's it. There are no other comments online, so thank you very much.
Okay. That was so helpful. Yes. What can do? Let's do it. 1 minute. Help us out.
Actually,
Yep, come up. We're giving you 1 minute. Yeah, everyone stand up.
oh my God.
We can do the exact same thing
Yeah,
if you want.
we can focus on our legs too. 'Cause
Okay.
that helps loosen up the back. You can just kind of lunge forward. I'm sure everybody knows this, and if you raise your hands, it kind of helps stretch everything more. Bend your knees to go a little deeper. You also open up your arms like this and kind of try to swing the other shoulder a little bit. Open up the hips, be careful, don't push it. And then you can go to the other side. And then kind of just stretching your legs. And you can kind of open up your arms. Okay, and then you can just kind of do this and kind of lean back a little. Not too much. And then last one, just to open up the shoulders a bit more. Do this. Breathe in one. Breathe out. Breathe in two. Breathe out. Breathe in three. And exhale. Okay.
Thank you, thank you. In the morning before. So, yeah. Did I? Time now. Because I plugged it back here. Let's see what happens if I. Yeah, so you can share it, but it's not on this screen. Nothing.
What we're doing now is doing a demo of the website. So if you have a computer, I actually recommend you open it up and go to PEMM.princeton.edu. You can also do it on your phone. And you may, if you have any problems, by all means tell us. I'm often working on my laptop and not checking the mobile view enough. So it could be quite helpful if you are doing that. Edu. So PEMM.princeton.edu. And it should take you there. Now, I can always show you, hold it up and show you, or
Hold it.
And was it working before?
Yeah.
Just trying to.
Yeah.
Yes.
I did. Wonderful. I'll check.
Yes.
What's happening?
Do you have another?
Transmission.
Sure you
Yeah,
have.
my.
There we go. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
Okay.
so while we're
I'm gonna send that to you. Right now.
waiting, is everyone got the homepage here?
So it's power.
PEMM.princeton.edu. Excellent. Nice. It's nice to see the whole of you. All right. So as we've kind of been talking about today, this is the Princeton Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Egyptian Miracles of Mary project. As you can see from the navigation bar we talked today, we have stories on the website. We have paintings of the stories, and we have the manuscripts of the stories appearance. So these are the three main things that our page is doing. And you can go into, we have here like featured paintings or featured manuscripts or featured stories, and you're welcome to go and check those out. This, the story that we read today is one of the featured stories, so you can just see it. But what I really want you guys to do right now is to click on that navigation bar, stories. And this takes you to basically a main part of the database where there is the list of the 1,000 stories. You can see up in here, it says results, 1,003 records. So that's how many stories we have in here. One of the things that was really important to me is that people be able to do research of their own, I think.
You're back.
Thank you, thank you. So I'm going to ask you guys to actually kind of demo yourself what is going on. So if we're in stories, you'll remember that I was saying that a lot of people said they were just translations. So we have here on the left what's called a filter. And this is what allows you to take these 1,000 stories and restrict it to certain subcategories. So if you were working with your students, you might say, hey, there was a thing that scholars used to say about the Miracle of Mary stories where they were all from France. Can you give me the answer to that question? Are they all from France? Excuse me. And then you could go down here and we actually have places of origin. On the left, it's one of the bottom ones, so you kind of have to scroll down. If you're in the mobile view, there's like a little hamburger with an arrow on it. On the top left, you have to go there to open up the filter. Then you could go in here and you could click on the word France. And it would tell you, oh yeah, they're really true. 7 stories are from France out of 1,000. So clearly France is a huge influence on this tradition, right? So to me, part of it is pedagogical, where you can tell the kids, hey, give me an answer to a question, and they can go in and they can kind of, they can prove that. So you might say, well, actually, I'm more interested in Spain, and you could do that. He's like, okay, 5 records, clearly not that much. Or you might say, well, really, what are the ones that are composed in Africa? And then you get way up, right? 817 records are from Africa. The reason why it's not as high is because while they're not from Europe, there are quite a few stories from the Levant. And what that means is from really early. This tradition is preserving stories from the 200s and 300s and 400s. So if you click on Levant, you'll actually get this 22 records. Or we have this early Christian world, because we're like, we don't know. Was it in Jerusalem? Was it in Syria? Was it in Egypt? We don't know. But here you get this 88 records. And these are the really early stories about Mary. They're often in something called the infancy gospel, and the Ethiopian tradition is preserving them in Ge'ez. So this is something you can do with students to talk about the way in which it's the most common thing that scholars do with Ethiopia is to say it's derivative. Everything, all the painting is actually Byzantine. All of the stories are actually French, all of the whatever. And it's a huge problem in this study. So you may find that in other aspects, if you're teaching African studies, where people are like, oh, well, you know, they only do that because of the British or something. So I like this as a pedagogical point, showing to students, no, there's a lot of originality, obviously, in Africa. You could also say, well, I'd like to teach for these stories, but I really want to make sure that it has a painting. So of the 1,000 stories, maybe 100 of them have paintings. So you could say, well, I just want to work on stories that have paintings. You could say, well, I only want this most illustrated, just means things that have the most illustrated, the most paintings, so that you can do kind of comparative work. Another thing that you might really want to do is say, I only want to see things with the English translation, because you're like, well, what's the point of looking at a story where you haven't translated it yet? We can't do anything with it as students. The most read in church, you know, these stories are very old, and some of them kept on in the tradition and some of them disappeared, even if they were very popular in the beginning. So most read in church is kind of a way of talking about the canon today in Ethiopia. What are the stories that you would most likely hear if you were going to church and hearing these stories read aloud? This was something that I forgot to say to you all, but these Tamata Mariam stories are treated as scripture in Ethiopia. They are something that are read aloud in church. I also was kind of interested, we have done some work on Arabic manuscripts. If you wanted to know what were the stories that they didn't move into Ge'ez, they only appear in Arabic. There's very few of them. This is not giving me the right response. It's great. No, that's not correct, but I need to remember that bug. There's also, you can distinguish here between things that happened during Mary's life, like her giving water to a dog in a shoe. That's something that she did as a teenager, or the stories of things she performed after she died for the people who called on her. You could also say, I only want to know about stories that are really early, like 1300s or 1400s. Or you could say, no, I really want to know, what have people been writing in the past, you know, past century? Is there a difference, or what kind of concerns do people have now? I see that this thing keeps on giving me 622 records, so I have some kind of bug here.
I think it maybe has crashed. I haven't been able to read it.
Oh, because we're all on it at the same time. Yeah, okay. It's not refreshing, sorry you guys. All right, but you can do stuff here. You can also use these things to kind of restrict it. You can also do something about popularity or commonness, which is how many manuscripts have this story. So probably half of our stories appear in only 1 or 2 manuscripts. So the popular stories are, I don't know, something interesting to think about. All right, so okay, you've done your research and you want, then you can go into a story. And I'm going to take you into the top story. Hopefully it's going to let me in here. I guess we do have 55 people on the website, but really it should not do that. It should stay up.
Have everybody get off of this now?
Yeah, maybe. All right, if people want to exit, that might help us out. I can see it doing its little circle. But what it's going to do is it's going to take us into a page where it's going to give you a lot of information about what manuscript, how old the manuscripts are that it first appeared in. You may remember that I said that we couldn't tell how old the story was, like the Cannibal of Kemmer story. I'm like, was that written in the 1900s? Was that written in the 1700s? And it appears in a manuscript from 1400. So we know that it's very, very, very early. All right, so this is just to give you kind of a sense for the page. I also wanted to make it a page. I felt like a lot of pages that are in the digital humanities, that's what this kind of project is called when you're collecting a lot of data about literature, that they were very impenetrable, like would just give you stats or would only give you tables like the previous page. So I wanted to have this where it was written out and more accessible to other people. So instead of just giving the date, we actually say this story with this short title is very old. It appears in manuscripts from 1400. We also say it's extremely common. It appears in 71% of our manuscripts. That's extremely high. This is one of the 15 most common. We also say that it's really illustrated. We have 93 paintings in the database of it. This is something that takes place after she died. This story actually was composed in Spain, one of the very few. And what languages? Then you'll get to a summary. You'll get to the actual translation here. There's a lot of technical information here, mostly for scholars. You can probably ignore it, but feel free to explore it. And then we also have something where if you want to read a second translation. The first translation is generally the best, but we do have other translations, so we're going to provide it. And then we give you the citation for those of you who are doing historical sources and you want your students to cite your primary sources. We give them something they can just copy and paste into there. So this is one way to approach it. Then if you're looking at paintings, you can go into this and the filter is across the top of the page. And you can say, well, I only want to see paintings from the 1300s. We have only one at this point. Or you could say, well, also the 1400s. I want to get a better sense of what's happening in that period. You could also say, I'm interested in where the manuscript was from inside of Ethiopia. This is pretty scholarly stuff. Most people aren't going to care about that. One thing I use a lot is we definitely have things where we don't have the image. We have a description of the image, but not the image itself. So you might be like, well, okay, I don't care about, don't show me any of those that have no image because I need the image. You can do things where you're like, okay, actually, I just want to see the ones that are in a particular place. So you could say, well, show me only things that are at Princeton, or I don't know, Library of Congress, etc. The other thing here is that this page had to be a bit more complicated. So these are all the paintings, but you can also do paintings by story. So if you're doing the paintings by story, you could say, okay, yeah, what about that cannibal story you were telling us about, Belcher? And then you could do cannibal or whatever. And then this will say, okay, all the paintings that are of this particular story. And here are the 94 paintings of this particular story. We do, and I'll show you one more thing here, but so there's that. Then if you find a painting that you want to look at, then you can go into the page and this is giving you, again, spelled out information about that painting. So this painting appears in a manuscript taken, that is a nice way of saying looted by the British from Ethiopia. And it's dated to the 1600s. We have a description of what's happening in each of these things and IDs and so on and whatever. The really fascinating thing about this one, and I can't zoom in, is do you see this character here? This is the cannibal, depicted as.
Spoilers, Wendy, spoilers.
Okay, good. All right. Thank you. Help us out. All right. And the thing about size, whatever. Good. Okay. So yes, that's just gonna be very exciting tomorrow. Jenica's talking tomorrow and you definitely want to do it.
Okay.
And you could also say, well, I want to view more. So there's different ways to go through this. All right. Dawit was going to talk about paintings and I already, yeah. So you can also go into maps and see like where in the world these different things are. Howard does have manuscripts, so you can kind of zoom in here and see. Where are we? Is this us? I think this is, well, I don't know. Anyways, so there's the map. The other thing here, which is, by the way, we're not quite fully developed, is we have this teaching with PEMM. So we're going to have different things here. And of course, we have, you know, the absolute brain trust of Brenda and Helen and Vanessa and others who are working to develop teaching things. So they'll have links here. But I also have a few things here, like if you're doing a lecture, we have something like kind of what I talked about today. What are they? Something about the paintings that's short. We have things about how to read one of the paintings. Jenica will talk more about that tomorrow. I have a whole thing in here about the educational system if you want to talk to kids about, hey, there are different ways of learning. And then I also have things where they're grouped. So you could say, well, I'm interested actually in the stories about disability. And then we have them here broken down, the stories that are about eyesight, etc. And you can look at them different ways. There is also the other way of going into this is through research and lessons where you could just look yourself, well, oh, stories about Ethiopian kings or paintings with halos or nature. A lot of these stories are quite extraordinary about nature, and nature really in a really amazing and powerful way being depicted, and lots of other things. And then, you know, our team. The final thing to say is that we do have this, we haven't announced it just yet because we're dealing with some bugs, but we do have the website available in a
That's cool. I like that.
I'm just going to say that we are the only Ethiopian studies website that has it in English.
It initially looks like an error message, but because we know we're learning about language, you know that is not.
Like, what is happening? Yeah, I went to a website and was all of a sudden Russian. Like, hackers. Okay, so Dawit was supposed to do part of this, and I just left it. Dawit, anything you want to talk about here that?
I guess the only thing it is about for the stories, when we're thinking about most popular stories, you could easily confuse it with like the most popular stories right now. You don't know why, but the printed edition that's used in the church doesn't always have the most popular stories. And actually sometimes what ends up in the printed edition is some of the rare stories from the manuscript tradition. So let me back up. So when we're talking about manuscripts, we have a collection of manuscript tradition that goes back to 14th century and onwards. For the past 600 years, there's this manuscript tradition of, you know, animal skin that I talked about earlier, and getting the plants and writing them down. Then we have the print edition. So they printed it, and then since it's printed, no longer copying, just print what's already, you know, before there's several editions. So in the print edition, you have stories that throughout the manuscript tradition, they were really popular, and sometimes they make it in the print edition, and sometimes they're not that popular, but they still made it to the print edition. But because they're prints, they come into the church and they're read, and the people are familiar with it. You see? So why that is important is, especially if you have a lot of Ethiopians or something like that, when you're reading, you want to like say, hey, you know this story,
the cannibal, they're gonna know that story. But outside of that, just make sure that you're looking at, okay, it's popular and it's prints, right? That's usually a way to kind of make sure that it's made it into the church. And even then, some of the print editions, not all of them are read nor like regularly. Another thing to do and to think about if you are going to read like several stories in a classroom is to read the popular stories with the like one-offs. There's some stories that are just present in one manuscript and it appears one time and that's it. So to me, it's fascinating. Sometimes you can learn a lot about the society that way by looking at, okay, what's being read a lot, what's not being read as often, and why, it's just one off in one manuscript. So that's just some interesting things to think about when you're selecting stories.
On that exact topic, actually, yes, let's answer some questions. There's a really amazing manuscript from a particular monastery called Debre Zamado. And you can see here, and it's all stories about things that happened at that Ethiopian monastery. And a lot of them are amazing. Truly, truly amazing. So yes, questions.
I was wondering if the members of your team who are here at our workshop, could we get a recommendation of a story from each of you that would work well in a high school history class? I mean, I teach high school, but I know there are other levels in the room. But could we get some titles, a title or two from you all that are just you would recommend for the classroom? That would be helpful to me.
Yeah, I would need to think about the titles and the ID numbers, but I personally like the day-to-day stories, right? And these are the type of things that people really think about when they think about the miracles of Mary or the miracles that she performs. People generally don't think about the canon. Generally, they think about the day-to-day, everyday experience. So those tend to be the ones written in Ethiopia around the 1600s. So if you search in especially the Ethiopian stories with the English translations, you'll find some of them. I would have to get back to you on the titles.
A really good question, yeah.
I don't know if you had some recommendations.
Well, just one thing to say is that this one here in the research and lessons, I have the one about the kings. And there's different stories about kings, but the ones I would highly recommend are these Zara Yaakov. He was a really important king. He's really the reason why Mary is so, there's so much devotion to her today. And he often wrote them himself. And he's a really gifted writer. So then you can be talking about a king, how he saw himself, some of it about how he conquered rebels or whatever. So I think those would work really well in history class because they're about an actual historian, but also kind of hagiographical. So it helps them to think about what's the bias or what's the orientation.
That would be great for your project, actually, that we talked about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you assume that there's filtering by age, by, I mean, it's not, maybe it's there, maybe it's not there, I don't know, but I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Going through all that, you can get lost if you read the wrong.
Absolutely.
You lose them already.
Yeah.
So it's just,
Yeah.
I'd love to be able to take some of your expertise back.
Absolutely. And you can email us. I'm wbelcher@princeton.edu. I'm really easy to find. I'm always happy to answer questions.
I'll write out my email. It's pretty long. So.
This is something we have been working on for months to find the stories that we think are the best ones that we're developing lessons on, but they're unfinished and we wanted to hear everything they had to say as well. But we are working on them. We have a resource folder and you will be privileged to see what they are and help us develop.
Herbal medicine.
That's a really good question.
What was the question?
About herbal medicine. There are stories where Mary is kind of a witch. And she does things with like dust and, giving people stuff and whatever. But herbal, I can't quite remember.
He does have a rich history. I mean, you should be talking to the stuff at work.
It's a really good question. We should look harder to see, to look for those and put them together like on a research post like that.
I
So you
just
can see
came
that
back
together.
I did a month in India, then 2 more months in Asia this week.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in Ayurvedic medicine.
Yeah.
And although my field is languages. And when I grow up, I think I want to be a medical doctor, but I have to find a university where I can pay for the degree. Because a lot of people have done that, but I think I'd be a good diagnostician. Because I think I'm deeper chopra oriented. I think it comes from the brain first. A lot of people aren't physically ill as much as they're mentally telling the body that the body is weak.
Yeah.
And they need more naturopathic healing.
Yeah.
So I wanted
Yeah.
I know we have like 1 minute left here.
A
y'all.
quick thing I wanted to say was the search bar, we haven't really utilized it, but you could like type in themes like kings, and then it'll pop up all the stories about kings. I especially like that for paintings. Jenica, stop me if I'm getting into your, but if I say like, for example, the Madonna painting, then I can have yes. Then I can have all the paintings with Mary with her child. One thing I really like to do is, okay, like 1300s and then 1400s, and then I could see the progression of how paintings kind of went over a period of time, and really get your students to look at this, what was different from 13 to 14 to 1500s, look at the features just by, limiting it down to a specific thing. So I think that's other ways that you could use the website that I really think is fascinating, right? Like we're looking at African paintings from really, really early periods.
Just want to check the question. Thanks. So robust. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.